Alright, hello and welcome to this training. If you are seeing this, then it's most likely December 1st, and there is about 30 days until the end of the month, which means there is exactly 30 days in which you can use to basically put yourself on a trajectory to completely change your life in 2026. So, with that said, as you can see from the title, what we are going to be covering today is how to become unrecognizable in 30 days. And as you can see from the overview, what we are going to be talking about more specifically is the behavioral reset goals, the 30 days overhaul, environmental lockdown, and input starvation, the review, and then your action items for the day or the next few days. So, with that said, let's get started and talk about the behavioral reset. So, there is a single principle that people misunderstood their entire lives. You don't always change your life by thinking differently first. Sometimes you can change your life by behaving differently long enough for your brain to basically update its internal assumptions about who you are. Now, thoughts follow evidence, identity follow actions, confidence follows proof. The person you believe yourself to be today is nothing more than a pattern of repeated behaviors that your brain got used to. So, when the behavior shifts, the identity starts dissolving and a new one starts to take its place. Now, the nervous system changes when it gets repeated signals that the old version of you is no longer in charge. When your actions stop matching your previous patterns, the brain stops reinforcing them because they are no longer serve a function. So, physical actions send data to the brain, not just the other way around, which is why acting differently can actually force an internal recalibration. Over time, all these physical cues build a new emotional baseline, which then builds a new mental narrative, or a new self image, or a new self concept, whatever you want to call it, which eventually becomes how you see yourself. And this is why 30 days is such a long, powerful window. It's long enough to basically disrupt your old identity and your old identity loops, but short enough that your mind doesn't panic and self sabotage. So, the old identity, its oxygen supply because you stop breathing with. So, the old identity, its oxygen supply because you. So the old identity is its oxygen supply because you stop feeding it with familiar behaviors, and what replaces that oxygen is simple repetition, which slowly anchors a new identity into the nervous system. So once you understand this, the next step is really to understand how to cut out the behaviors that basically keep your old self alive so that there is room for a new one to form. So before you build anything, you clear the debris. So before you build anything, you clear the debris, right? Reinvention always has to begin with some form of abstraction. It removes hidden anchors that quietly pull you backward. You are not adding discipline yet. You are not adding any habits. You are simply removing what drains you, distracts you, or destabilizes you so that you can build from a clean slate. Essentially, you can't expect momentum if you Essentially, if you essentially you can't accept momentum if your daily rituals and everything you do on a day-to-day basis completely contradicts your goals for the next 30 days. So, the first move is removing everything that keeps you tied to the identity that you're trying to outgrow. So, you start by eliminating the habits that directly erode your capacity to execute. And these are the obvious culprits, but also they are usually the ones that you defend out of habit. So, you need to completely cut out things such as alcohol, junk food, weird sleep patterns, late night dopamine binges, and repetitive scrolling. These are just the basics, and all of them drain your cognitive bandwidth more than you actually realize. So, cutting it just doesn't work unless you swap the void with something neutral. Otherwise, you will just slip back into doing those things. So, for example, you can replace snacks with water or overstimulation and scrolling on your phone with just a little bit of silence or reading books, for example. So, removing the destructive trigger will, in general, reduce the emotional roller coasters that and brings your nervous system basically back to a calm baseline. And you also need to clear any physical reminders of the old identity, like any clutter, messy spaces, digital chaos. You can even throw out or give to charity some clothes and items in general. Just get rid of as much as possible on those 30 days. When the physical world is clean, your brain spends less energy trying to orient itself, so simple environmental will just reduce the friction so that taking positive action become easier and more automatic than not. So once the destructive habits are gone, you just need to look at the habits that aren't necessarily harmful but still slow your momentum down. So first you should shrink the behavior. So first you should shrink the behaviors that aren't hurting you. So first you should first you should shrink the behaviors that aren't hurting you directly but keep you scattered and unfocused. So entertainment that numbs you, for example, or conversation that dilute your ambition, certain people in your life. And if you want to learn more about this, you can see the previous video I made. And any activities that feel productive but aren't actually really moving you, and any activities that I feel and any activities that feel productive but aren't actually really moving you closer to anything meaningful. All of them need strict boundaries. So decide when and how much you consume, and you can set specific windows for consumption rather than allowing it to bleed you into your productive hours. And try to make sure that you track how much time you actually spend on these things so that you can see where the real leaks are, and make sure your allocation serves your goals first before allowing space for low value activities. Now, by reducing you will by reducing you will be able to stop accidental self-sabotage through overstimulation. Also, try to reduce the number of micro decisions you make daily so that the brain doesn't burn out on nonsense. So, for example, you can batch tasks or prepare routines in advance and cut out any necessary choices. You can batch tasks or prepare routines in advance and cut out any unnecessary choices. A streamlined day in general will free up mental energy for the habits you are about to build. Now, after reducing, you finally created the space to introduce small shifts that actually support your goals. Now you can fill the gaps with upward pulling behaviors. These don't obviously they don't need to they don't need to be like intense or something like that. You shouldn't be throwing yourself into the deep end immediately. They simply need to tilt you into the right direction. So replace any reactive mornings with more structured ones. For example, replace nighttime dopamine binges with rituals that are actually calming. This replacement will just give your brain a clear signal of what the new identity actually values. And after a while, the new behavior will start feeling more natural than the old ones. Now, every low value action needs to get swapped for something that reinforces discipline, even in small ways. So, you can trade endless scrolling for reading, like I said earlier, or trade reality shows for silence or classical music, etc. Or for example, instead of watching a reality show, you can just go to a step backward and just watch a documentary. So, these upgrades will slack quietly. So these upgrades just stack quietly and quietly because so these upgrades just will so these upgrades just stack quietly and quickly because they don't really require a lot of willpower, just awareness of what you are actually doing. Now, behavior is one of the most important aspects as to how identity is built. So your brain believes what you are repeatedly demonstrate and do so. So, when you stop acting like that old you, your mind stops identifying with the old you. It's that simple. So, identity becomes a trailing effect, not necessarily a starting point. Most people try to change who they are first and then behave accordingly, which obviously that can work. We do a lot of that with our private clients. But in these 30 days, most people try to change who they are first and then behave accordingly, which obviously that can work. We do a lot of that with our private clients. But in these 30 days, you're basically trying to flip the whole thing. You're trying to do all of that work in a shorter amount of time. So in these 30 days, you need to flip that order. You behave differently while still feeling like your old self, and eventually the gap closes. So every action you take sends a signal to your brain about who you are becoming. When your actions contradict your old habits for long enough, the identity built on these habits collapses. And so, once the identity begins shifting and changing, decision making becomes a bit easier because you feel internally aligned. And as your identity adjusts, you will feel uncomfortable basically doing the things the old way because they know. And as your identity adjusts, you will feel uncomfortable basically doing the things old way because they no longer really match who you are becoming or who you are in those 30 days. And you will notice friction where there used to be comfort, and eventually the new behavior will just feel natural and the old behavior will feel more foreign. Now, once that identity starts shifting, the only thing that really locks it in is repetition and consistency. So, the nervous system upgrades through frequency. You don't need some crazy monk like discipline, you just need reliable follow throughs. And when you perform the same behavior repeatedly across consistent conditions, your brain basically rewires. So, over time, you become someone who acts automatically in alignment over time, you become someone who acts automatically in alignment with the identity you are actually building. So, daily repetition will build familiarity, and familiarity will build stability. And the more you repeat a behavior, the less resistance your mind will generate. And what once felt like effort eventually becomes your baseline and start to feel way more natural. And every day you stick to your behaviors, you vote for your future self. So, completing the behaviors builds trust in your own reliability, and that trust will lead to belief, and that belief will lead to internal certainty. Now, consistency eventually shifts from something you are doing into something you just are. The behaviors stop requiring motivation, and the habits log into your identity and basically operate in the background. Like, for example, like I, for example, don't have to think about sitting here and writing every day because it's just something that happens regardless of whether I feel like it or not. So, with a core reset in motion, the next move is all giving all of this. So, with a core reset in motion, the next move is giving all of this direction. So, you are not just behaving differently, but actually aiming all that energy towards something that's meaningful and structured. So let's talk about ABTH goals. You need to lock in absolute clarity before you try to change anything because your brain cannot follow direction it cannot see. You need to sit down and extract the actual truth of where your life stands right now without softening it or decorating it. Vague starting points always produce vague outcomes. So you should start so you should st- so you should treat this like a diagnostics of your life. When you write the truth about without any filters, you basically immediately create leverage and you create pressure because now you know where you are and you kind of know where you want to go. And that leverage will push you in ways that motivation never could. So this clarity becomes the anchor that guides every decision you make over the next 30 days. And the clearer it is, the faster you will move. So the ABTH framework is something that I talked about in a different video, but it's clarity engine that basically gives you a fixed starting point, a defined target, a compressed timeline, and the exact habits that bridges the gap. So you should treat it like the blueprint that basically removes any confusion, remove any emotional guesswork, and forces you into structure that you can actually follow. And when you use ABTH properly, you will know exactly where you stand, exactly who you are becoming, exactly how fast you need to move, and exactly what you will be doing every day to make that identity shift. And exactly what you will be doing every day to make that identity shift real. So the framework gives your brain certainty, direction, and pressure, which is why it sits at the center of this entire process. So what ABT stands for is actually becoming timeline and habits. Now, actual refers to your current reality across your habits, your routine, your patterns, your numbers, and your behaviors. The four pillars of health, wealth, love, and self. This is your real starting point. Now, B stands for becoming, and this is the desired reality you are growing into. Here, you basically define the goal and what your habits and actions must align with. T stands for timeline. This is the fixed timeline in which you intend to accomplish the goal, and the timeline creates pressure and urgency and basically forces faster adaptation by giving your brain a clear deadline and no room for negotiation. So in this case, it's the 30-day container that we are talking about. And H stands for habits. Habits are the behavior you install so that the transformation doesn't stay theoretical but becomes visible and measurable. And these are the daily actions you will need to do to basically transform your actual into your becoming. Now, starting with actual, you need to document your real numbers, your real patterns, and your real tendencies. Your system needs hard data to operate with. So write down your habits and number as they currently are. Even if you dislike the truth, this is really important. You should stop lying to yourself about where you are, and then you can, for example, for example, list your weight, your meals, your sleep, your income, your work hours, and content consumption, your social habits. This reveals the real architecture of your life and then pinpoint what drains you, what distracts you, what wastes your time, what keeps you looping in the same place basically and keeps you running in circles. These patterns must be disrupted and then capture your default emotional response, your default impulses, and your default excuses. The old identity hides inside these details, and then finally, you should tell the truth without sugarcoating it. This process will basically shatter the illusion that you have less to fix than you actually do. Radically, honestly, Radical, honest, radical honesty here will give you a baseline that removes any denial and forces responsibility. Once you see the truth clearly, you have no other choice but to basically change it. You will see the gap between your desired life and your actual actions, and the realization that will hit you in a way that you cannot ignore. And if you accept that this is the starting point, is simple information, and you don't shame yourself, then you can use it for fuel. You can use it as a fuel for change. So keep the language simple and blunt so your brain cannot twist your reality into something softer. So once the truth is on the table and the real you is no longer hiding an abstraction, you will feel an immediate need to define who you are, who you must become to basically escape the version of yourself